My 33rd birthday fell on a Tuesday, which meant the Anderson family gathering happened the following Saturday at my parents' house in suburban Denver. Same dining room where I'd blown out candles for 3 decades. Same relatives asking the same polite questions about my career. Same underlying tension about whether I'd ever amount to anything worthwhile. Growing up as the middle child between my sister Rebecca's medical school achievements and my younger brother Jason's law degree from Columbia taught me early that academic success in the Anderson family was measured by prestige, not passion. Rebecca was finishing her cardiology residency at Johns Hopkins. Jason had just made partner at a white shoe Manhattan law firm. Me. I was Dr. Sarah Anderson, molecular biologist, whose research into cellular aging mechanisms apparently didn't qualify as a real career. Sarah's still at the university, Mom would explain to distant relatives, using the tone people reserved for chronic illnesses. Research very specialized. Dad was more direct. As a successful orthopedic surgeon who'd built a thriving private practice, he measured professional worth in terms of patient outcomes and annual income. My work, studying telomere degradation in stem cells, was, in his view, academic masturbation that contributed nothing meaningful to the world. "When are you going to get a real job?" had become his standard greeting after I finished my postdoc at Stanford 5 years ago. One that actually helps people. The question stung because I genuinely believed my research could help people, potentially millions of them. For 8 years I'd been investigating why certain stem cell populations seemed immune to the cellular aging process that limited most tissue regeneration. My hypothesis was that understanding this mechanism could lead to treatments for age-related diseases, maybe even interventions that could extend healthy human lifespan. But trying to explain the clinical implications of telomerase activation pathways to family members who viewed anything outside their own expertise as irrelevant was like describing symphony music to people who'd gone voluntarily deaf. "Sarah's working on something with cells," Mom would tell dinner guests, waving her hand vaguely. "Very complicated. Rebecca's saving actual hearts, though. She performed 3 surgeries this week." The comparison was constant and brutal. Rebecca's work was concrete, immediate, life-saving. She could describe her day in terms anyone could understand. Blocked arteries cleared, heart rhythms restored, patients walking out of the hospital. My work involved cell cultures, microscopic imaging, and statistical analysis of molecular processes that took months to yield meaningful data. Jason wasn't much better. His legal victories were public, measurable, reported in newspapers. He won cases, negotiated deals, made headlines. My victories were papers published in journals most people had never heard of, read by maybe 200 specialists worldwide. 20 papers in 8 years, Dad had said during last year's birthday dinner, as if announcing a terminal diagnosis. "How many people have you actually helped?" "Rebecca saved a dozen lives just this week." I tried explaining that basic research was the foundation for all medical advances, that understanding cellular mechanisms today would lead to treatments tomorrow, that some of the most important discoveries in history had taken decades to reach practical application. But Dad's attention would drift after the first few sentences, and the conversation would inevitably return to Rebecca's latest surgery or Jason's most recent courtroom triumph. The worst part was, they weren't wrong. 8 years of research had produced exactly 0 treatments, 0 therapies, 0 interventions that improved anyone's life in a measurable way. I had theories, hypotheses, preliminary data, and a growing collection of peer-reviewed publications that impressed my colleagues but meant nothing to my family. This year's birthday dinner followed the familiar script. Rebecca flew in from Baltimore with stories about a complex heart transplant she'd assisted on the week before. Jason joined us via video call from his Manhattan office, preparing for a corporate merger that would make national news. And I sat in the same chair I'd occupied since childhood, listening to my siblings describe their latest accomplishments while mentally rehearsing how I'd explain my recent grant rejection from the National Institutes of Health. "So, Sarah," Aunt Linda asked during the appetizer course, "how's your research going?" "Still working with those molecules." "Cells," I corrected gently. "I study stem cell aging mechanisms, specifically how certain stem cell populations maintain telomere length despite repeated division cycles." The familiar glassy-eyed look appeared on Aunt Linda's face. "That's nice, dear. Very scientific." Dad set down his wine glass with the slight thump that usually preceded his annual assessment of my career trajectory. My stomach tightened as he cleared his throat and looked at me with the expression he reserved for delivering bad news to patients. "Sarah, I want to talk to you about something," he began, using his serious doctor voice. "You're 33 years old. You've been working on this research for how long now?" 9 years if you count my graduate work, I said, knowing this would only make his point stronger. 9 years. And in all that time you've published, he paused, pretending to recall the number. 27 papers in peer-reviewed journals, I said quietly, including 3 in Cell and 1 in Science. Right. Papers. He leaned back slightly. But Sarah, here's what I don't understand. Rebecca performs surgery on real patients with real problems. She fixes hearts, saves lives, makes a tangible difference every single day. Jason wins cases that affect actual companies, real people, meaningful outcomes. But your papers, who reads them? What do they accomplish? The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone at the table was watching me with expressions ranging from sympathetic curiosity to outright pity. Even Jason had stopped checking his phone to hear my response. "Dad," I said carefully, "basic research is the foundation for all medical advances. The treatments Rebecca uses, the surgical techniques, the medications, they all started with someone doing basic research into cellular mechanisms. But when does your research turn into something that actually helps people?" he pressed. "You've been saying, someday, for 9 years. Rebecca started helping people on day 1 of her residency." I felt the frustration rising in my throat. How do you explain that breakthrough discoveries often take decades? That most basic research never leads to practical applications, but the few studies that do revolutionize everything? That understanding biological mechanisms is valuable in itself, even without immediate clinical payoff? "You'll never publish anything significant," Dad announced, leaning back with the finality of a terminal diagnosis. 20 years of experiments, failed experiments, and what do you have to show for it? Rebecca saves lives. Jason wins cases. You write papers that sit in libraries collecting dust. The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel but because they echoed the doubts that kept me awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was wasting my life chasing discoveries that would never matter outside a handful of academic circles. "Honey," Mom added in her soothing voice, "your father just wants you to be successful. Maybe it's time to consider medical school. You could still become a doctor like Rebecca. Or law school," Jason suggested from the screen. "Your analytical skills would transfer well. I could help you get into Columbia." Everyone nodded along as if staging an intervention to save me from my own poor judgment. The birthday girl whose life choices had become the family's greatest disappointment. 20 years of failed experiments, Dad repeated, warming to his theme. "At what point do you admit this isn't working?" I looked around at the faces of people who loved me but fundamentally didn't understand me. Rebecca with her measurable patient outcomes. Jason with his headline-making legal victories. Mom and Dad with their concrete definitions of success. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob with their polite confusion about what exactly I did all day. I took a sip of wine, set the glass down carefully and said the only thing I could. "Time will tell." Because what else could I say? That I was 6 weeks away from publishing research that would fundamentally change how the medical community understood cellular aging? That 18 months of data suggested a mechanism that could extend healthy human lifespan by decades? That 3 major pharmaceutical companies had already expressed interest in licensing opportunities? I couldn't say any of that, not until Nature's editorial board rendered its decision. In science, nothing is real until it's published and validated. So I smiled politely and let the conversation drift back to Rebecca's upcoming conference, Jason's vacation plans, the new restaurant downtown. We sang happy birthday around a chocolate cake from my favorite bakery. Everyone gave thoughtful gifts and warm hugs. And I went home thinking about the email I'd received 3 days earlier from Dr. Margaret Chin, senior editor at Nature, informing me that the final reviewer comments on my paper were overwhelmingly positive and that I should expect a decision within 2 weeks. 2 weeks turned out to be exactly 10 days. I was sitting in my laboratory the following Tuesday afternoon, analyzing protein expression data from my latest batch of stem cell cultures, when my phone rang. The number on the screen made my pulse race. "Dr. Anderson, this is Dr. Margaret Chin from Nature magazine. came the voice I'd been hoping to hear. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. My heart rate spiked, but I kept my voice steady. Not at all, Dr. Chin. Thank you for calling. I have excellent news about your submission, she said. The editorial board has voted unanimously to publish your paper on stem cell telomere maintenance mechanisms. More than that, we'd like to feature your research as this month's cover story. I closed my eyes and felt 9 years of work crystallize into this single moment. Nature magazine cover story. The most prestigious publication in all of science. The journal that published Darwin's theory of evolution and Watson and Crick's structure of DNA. Dr. Anderson, are you there? I'm here, I said. Just processing this news. I understand completely. Your research represents a fundamental breakthrough in our understanding of cellular aging. The implications for regenerative medicine and longevity research are staggering. Our editorial team is calling it the most significant advance in stem cell biology in the last decade. I thanked Dr. Chin and hung up the phone. For a long moment, I just sat in my laboratory chair, staring at the cell culture dishes while the reality sank in. In less than a week, researchers around the world would be reading about my discovery. Pharmaceutical companies would be calling with licensing offers. Medical schools would be inviting me to give lectures. The research Dad had dismissed as failed experiments would be recognized as groundbreaking science. But first, I had a birthday celebration to conclude. I drove back to my parents' house, where the family was still gathered around the dining room table, picking at leftover cake and rehashing my uncertain career prospects. Sarah. Mom exclaimed as I walked through the front door. Did you forget something? Actually, I wanted to share some news, I said, pulling out my phone just as it rang again. Dr. Chin's number on the screen. This is the call I've been waiting for. Dad looked up from his conversation with Uncle Bob about golf handicaps. What call? I put the phone on speaker. Dr. Anderson, this is Margaret Chin from Nature again. I apologize for calling back so quickly, but our media relations team wants to coordinate the press release for your cover story. The New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN have already submitted interview requests based on the preliminary announcement. The dining room fell silent. Dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Rebecca, in the middle of describing her latest surgical technique to Aunt Linda, turned to stare at me with wide eyes. Press release, Mom whispered. Yes, Dr. Chin continued. Dr. Anderson's breakthrough in stem cell aging mechanisms is being hailed as a potential game-changer for regenerative medicine. We're expecting significant media coverage when the issue publishes next week. Dad set down his fork with a trembling hand. Margaret, could you explain what exactly Sarah discovered? Dr. Anderson has identified the molecular mechanism that allows certain stem cell populations to maintain telomere length indefinitely, essentially making them immune to cellular aging. The implications for treating age-related diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, are extraordinary. This could be the foundation for therapies that extend healthy human lifespan by decades. The birthday cake sat forgotten on the table as everyone stared at me like I had just revealed the ability to fly. Dr. Anderson, Dr. Chin continued, Harvard Medical School has already requested your availability for a faculty position. The Broad Institute wants to discuss establishing a new research center around your work. And I should mention that Regeneron, Genentech, and Johnson & Johnson have submitted preliminary licensing inquiries through our legal department. I thanked her and ended the call. When I looked up, my family was staring at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in 9 years. Sarah. Dad's voice was barely a whisper. You're going to be on the cover of Nature magazine. Next month's issue, I confirmed, sitting back down and reaching for my abandoned piece of cake. The editorial board called it the most significant advance in stem cell biology in the last decade. Your failed experiments, Rebecca said slowly, her expression caught somewhere between awe and disbelief, are going to change medicine. That's what the peer reviewers concluded, I said, taking a bite of chocolate cake as though I weren't describing research that would reshape humanity's understanding of aging. Jason's face filled the computer screen, his earlier distraction replaced by sharp focus. Sarah, when you say licensing inquiries from pharmaceutical companies. I interrupted. The 3 largest biotech companies in the world want to turn my research into therapies for age-related diseases. Early projections suggest applications worth tens of billions in annual revenue. Dad opened his mouth then closed it again, seemingly unable to remember how speech worked. My phone buzzed with a text from my department chair. CNN wants to interview you tomorrow morning. NYT reporter flying in tonight. Harvard called, offering full professor with tenure. I showed the text to Dad, who read it twice before handing the phone back with shaking hands. Sarah, Mom said softly, reaching across the table, why didn't you tell us how important your research was? I considered the question carefully. I tried, I said. But you couldn't see the significance until nature validated it for you. The admission lingered in the air like incense. For 9 years I'd been describing my work to family members who measured success in immediate, tangible outcomes. They couldn't understand that some of the most important discoveries in history emerged from basic research that seemed irrelevant. Until it wasn't. We thought, Dad said slowly, that you were just playing around in laboratories. I was playing around in laboratories, I agreed. That's how scientific breakthroughs happen. You experiment until you discover something that changes everything. My phone rang again. This time it was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, director of the National Institute on Aging. Dr. Anderson, I hope you're prepared for what's about to happen. Your Nature paper is going to make you the most famous aging researcher in the world overnight. We'd like to discuss a 10-year research grant to fund the largest longevity study in human history. When I hung up, the entire table was staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to reverence. The most famous aging researcher in the world, Aunt Linda repeated. Apparently, I said, finishing my birthday cake while my family processed the reality that the disappointment of the Andersons had just become the name everyone in medicine would know. Dad cleared his throat. Sarah, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. For what? I asked, genuinely curious. For not believing in you. For not understanding that what you were doing was important. For suggesting that 20 years of research was a waste of time. 9 years, I corrected gently. But I understand why you couldn't see the significance. Cellular aging mechanisms aren't exactly dinner table conversation. We're not strangers, Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. We're your family. We should have trusted that you knew what you were doing. You should have asked better questions about my research, I said softly, instead of assuming it was irrelevant. Over the next 2 weeks, my life transformed completely. The Nature paper generated more media coverage than any scientific publication I'd ever seen. CNN, BBC, NPR, and 60 other outlets ran features about the breakthrough that could extend human lifespan. Harvard offered me a full professorship with a salary higher than Dad's surgical income. Pharmaceutical companies submitted licensing bids totaling more than $2 billion. My family, meanwhile, became my biggest advocates. Dad told his golf buddies about his daughter, the genius scientist who might cure aging. Mom carried copies of Nature in her purse to show strangers. Rebecca asked for advice on incorporating longevity research into her practice. Jason offered to help negotiate licensing deals. The birthday dinner that was supposed to be another intervention about my uncertain career became the moment my family finally understood that some achievements can't be measured until they reach a level of recognition that makes their importance undeniable. I used part of the licensing revenue to establish the Anderson Institute for Cellular Aging Research, funding students whose projects were too experimental for traditional grants. Students like I had been, working on ideas their families might not understand until the breakthrough moment arrived. The research Dad once dismissed as failed experiments had become the foundation of discoveries that could extend human lifespan by decades. Sometimes the most important contributions to human knowledge come from people working on problems that seem irrelevant, until the world realizes they were essential all along. Sometimes playing around in laboratories is the most serious work of all.